Thank you, Ji. Let's start formally. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks to Hamza as well for taking time out from very busy schedule from one meeting to another meeting. Thank you so much. We have been putting up from this forum, Policy Dialogue of SDPI Pakistan, that COVID-19 is really a mix of complex challenges. It has disrupted the economies the world over, and it has put serious trade-offs of prosperity or the people life. And it has putting the government the challenges to come up with the policy responses, because the trade-offs are very serious. On the one side, it is the economy, on side, the other side are the people. To see what are the options available to respond to COVID-19. We have today with Hamza Ali Malik with us. He is a director, macroeconomic and finance for development division at UNSCAP Bangkok. So Hamza, it is. I have already sent you can talk whatever you like, but we would like you to touch on those guiding questions. Once you are done with your first intervention, we will have some interventions from Dr. Vakar Saab and Dr. Solari Saab. And then, of course, we will be following a question answer session. So this is the brief set of this policy dialogue. And without any delay, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you. So the distinguishing features of the report, just to put things in context. One, we pursued a cross sectoral kind of approach following the Sustainable Development Agenda, essentially three pillars, broad ones: economic, social, and environment. When we try to do the assessments and try to come up with policy measures. That's one. And I'll go through the basic messages in a minute. The second major feature was we very carefully distinguish between immediate policy measures that are needed, like literally now, and the measures that should be put in place in a way from a medium to long-term perspective. Because we don't see it going away in the near future, at least for the next year or so. It's going to be one way or the other affecting people and affecting economies and so on and so forth. The third thing is we really emphasize the importance of fiscal policy or fiscal position or fiscal measures. Just for a brief context, why we had to sort of put out the fiscal angle much more deliberately. In a lot of engagements that we had, for instance, within the UN system globally and in the country teams and across regional commissions, literally across the globe, the initial, for instance, just to share with you, initially there was a lot of concern that the debt is going to go up considerably and government needs to be careful. There was a kind of blog came out from Geeta Gopinath, also from IMF, and putting a sort of a qualifier: countries should consider fiscal measures provided they have fiscal space or look at the debt positions. So we disagreed with that completely, and we wanted to put out a very clear message: irrespective of fiscal positions, countries need to go ahead. Let me try now come to this bit of specifics, about 1 minute each for each pillar, what essentially we are saying. So first thing, of course, we all understand now, it's a what you call a very complex confluence of multiple shocks, both from the demand side and supply side. Our assessment is demand side shock now, or at least in the near future, is going to dominate the supply considerations. What it means is there are not going to be much concerns on the inflation side. In fact, the contraction in the economy and unemployment and those concerns are going to be much, much bigger. So that's out there. The second one, of course, I already said, fiscal policy has to take lead, irrespective of fiscal positions, and I'll explain that what it means. And monetary measures or financial sector measures can be there, but they are essentially complementing the lead by fiscal authorities. We've also discussed in terms of promoting regional cooperation, especially when we were working with the Secretary General before his meetings with the G20 and IMF and World Bank heads, to put a global emergency health fund and to put together a debt relief or debt deferral kind of mechanisms in consultation with the global lenders in particular. Again, there was a lot of debate whether we're going to go for that or not, but again, this was one of our major recommendations and we pushed for that. And I think those things have been incorporated. Then when we talk about fiscal measures, I think we also want to go into the little bit second tier, and that when we get into the social pillar, so to speak. So one immediate finding that we have is those countries that have decent health and social protection systems are in a better position to actually deal with crises of this nature. So one fundamental message, of course, obviously, is countries should invest in these systems if they have not done already in that line. Again, it means essentially fiscal measures. And I don't agree with this message. I heard that in the Pakistani context also. The Pakistan is a poor country, or fiscal position is not that strong, so we cannot afford these kind of steps. I totally disagree. There's a lot of flexibility in budgets is already there. If it is not, it should be created on literally war footings, so to speak. So that's a fundamental message on there. Then on the environment side, actually, we noticed few other things. There is already a noticeable change or reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, those kind of things, because of a very drastic and sudden decline in economic activity. So that's a plus point, and we are reiterating the message that this should be taken as an opportunity. So for instance, those businesses who are still investing in fossil fuel-based industries, for instance, should not be supported or should not be given priority. Those businesses who are going after low carbon footprint kind of investments should be encouraged through all measures, through all support that they need. That's one way to sort of try and use it as an opportunity, the crisis, to nudge economies in a direction that is more sustainable over time. One last point, and I'll stop at that. First cut is technology or use of computers. What we're doing right now, interacting over email, computers, is actually probably going to have very long-lasting impacts on individual lives, communities, how we organize our work, so on and so forth. And for that to happen, digital divide has to be addressed. Internet access, in simple words, has to be really made sure people have that access over time. I mean, our kids' education, for instance, right now is dependent on this technology, but a lot of people in developing countries simply don't have access. So they'll be really left out, with very considerable impact on inequalities going forward. I stop here. Welcome the comments or any follow-up questions at this point in time, and we'll be happy to explain further. Thanks, Adit.
Let me bring now Dr. Sulari Saab for his initial remarks and feedback or comments. Sir.
Thank you, Hamza, or thanks to Sajid for sending me your report, so I could actually went through it, और उसका जो मैसेज आपने देने की कोशिश की, ह्यूमैनिटी फर्स्ट ओवर इकोनॉमी, I think that's very timely message, looking at all the three pillars. अब पाकिस्तान के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में जब हम बात करते हैं, तो मेरा ख्याल है पाकिस्तान में मैक्रो इकोनॉमी पे मुझे भी थोड़ी सी कंफ्यूजन जो है वो प्रिवेल होती नजर आती है. वो कंफ्यूजन है कोर्स जो हमारा एक्सटेंडेड फंड फैसिलिटी EFF जो IMF के साथ हमारा प्रोग्राम चल रहा है, और जो अब हम the second is about the whole discussion and debate on our monetary side. We had a lot of discussion on interest rate lowering. Your previous institute, State Bank of Pakistan, whether it should be to boost market confidence or business, to give a positive message to businesses, or whether interest rate should be lowered so that the government debt servicing debt can be decreased and government have some cushion to spend on corona responses. And when there was this decrease in interest rate, we saw the value of rupee depreciating by manifold.
Can't hear you, Abid. Can't hear you anymore.
Yeah, and I was saying that this is the last point, that when we saw some reduction in interest rate, we also saw it accompanied with the depreciation of value of rupee against dollar. So for an economy like Pakistan, I think for policymakers, it's really important to understand your message very clearly, that yes, in the famous fable of ant and cricket, where ant was working very diligently and cricket was playing around, it's not all the time that the ant has to win. Sometimes cricket comes and rules. So I think this pandemic is bringing us to a point where crickets like Pakistan, who were just tripping around and perhaps not reforming their fiscal or economic foundations that were now they are ruling, because there would be fiscal deficit, there would be fiscal gap, but while remaining in this IMF program, how to go forward, and what role state bank can play in it?
Okay, let me try and respond quickly to basic observations quickly, and then I think we'll have more questions for sure. First thing, I think one message we try to put out in our report when we say prioritize people over economy, we actually mean set aside any economic conversation, discussion, what's going to happen to stock market or government or fiscal position or balance of payments. No, you simply have to government has to give a lot of clarity that they mean business in terms of addressing to the extremely urgent needs of the people. That message has not come out, as far as I'm concerned, from the Pakistan perspective. In fact, it has only added to the noise. Noise meaning there has been different voices coming out of Pakistan, from the provinces, something different, from the federal government, something different. There was a lot of reluctance to go after lockdown and the modalities of lockdown and so on and so forth. Then there was confusion over, oh, if we lock down, there will be implications for economy. To me, that is not the message. It should not have been the message, and the crisis does not call for that. It calls reassurance by the government to its people that whatever it takes, they will support their people in this extraordinary, unprecedented time. So that's one. On the monetary policy side, I think my understanding of the central bank's measures have been a bit different. I was in a conversation with Murtaza, the new deputy governor, a few times prior to the decision, so we exchanged a lot of views. I think we were very clear, we were on the same page. But the way you put it, my understanding is a bit different. Interest rates are not lower to boost business confidence or try and lower government debt servicing so they have fiscal space. My understanding is interest rate lowering actually is the consequence of other measures that are needed, that the system is forcing in Pakistan and globally, which essentially are massive and substantial liquidity injections in the system. It's a sort of a natural consequence, the way the balance sheets work. Once you economic activity, it automatically actually pulls the liquidity out of the system. So central banks have to step in to make sure their actions are consistent in terms of prevailing market interest rates. They have to lower interest rates. There will be more room to lower interest rates for sure, because they get a lot of reassurance from the inflation outlook. But again, the decision will be primarily driven by how much further liquidity and other credit support will be needed in the system. The benefits that the government may get in debt servicing is of secondary importance at this point in time, but definitely, of course, will help. But central banks should continue to do that. I hope I didn't miss anything, but we can take it up again. I pause here. Thanks.
Thank you, Hamza. Thank you for highlighting some sort of policy level confusion going on in Pakistan. Let me now bring Dr. Waqar Saab for his thoughts on Dr. Waqar Saab.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Hamza. Thank you, Dr. Suleri. I just have 3 points to keep on the table. I think they are related to what both of you have just discussed. My first point is that the fact that central banks all across the world were quick to respond, and the fact that Treasury was slow to respond, I think calls for question, calls for observation, that probably treasuries around the world will have to change the way they respond to such times. Of course, they haven't been trained for such times, and hence the delay in responding. So I do agree with Dr. Hamza's observation that fiscal policy's response should be clear, should be quick, transparent. But I think I'll just go a step further, and maybe for the interest of our group, keep on the table that perhaps we need to revive our confidence and trust in rule-based fiscal policy, because this is where you give greater confidence and some level of discretion to the Treasury branch if you have a well-practicing rule-based fiscal policy in the country. The fact that we may have overly tightened the way we manage our treasury, and the fact that Dr. Abdul Hafiz Sheikh felt compelled to go back to the standing committees, the Prime Minister. Of course, then there was a controversy whether to call in the National Economic Council meeting or not. This may have delayed the decision making, and we do see some level of confusion currently as well. The announcements which were made regarding Prime Minister's economic package, which had a lot of fiscal interventions, and the approvals which were given yesterday by the ECC, where you had these specific allocations under the PM's package, had some discrepancies. But we're not criticizing anyone here. We know that everybody's trying to firefight, but just trying to make a case for greater respect for rule-based fiscal policy going forward. And it's not just about the crisis phase, it's also about the post-crisis phase. My second point is that perhaps this is the time when we need to also make a case for greater participatory democracy in economic decision making. The fact that both the central bank and the Treasury announced a package with weak consultation with the business community resulted in a pushback, resulted in resentment from several quarters of private sector enterprises who could not see what help they were getting from the fiscal side. However, they did make the case that we are being asked to protect the jobs. We are being asked not to lay off the workers. We are being asked to even pay the advanced salaries, but we are not clear how we are going to be helped by the government. And this is where perhaps clarity was required, and clarity would have been there had there been a minimal consultative process with not just the big firms, but also the MSMEs, and hence the call for greater participatory democracy in economic decision making. My third and final point is that perhaps this consultative process is now all the more necessary when government is not only approaching the IMF for the rapid finance instrument facility, and we do understand that within the RFI, while it will be parked with the central bank, there will be allocations which can be used for fiscal purposes, including deficit financing. So I think this is the time that while allocations for RFI are being firmed up, and we know that both the World Bank, ADB, and perhaps other partners would also piggyback on this facility. They've already been working on their packages. I think this is the time to put in place the consultative process with the business community and with other groups who are feeling the heat at the moment, consumer groups, trade unions, labor unions. Now is the time to bring in their representatives and start discussing. Now, Dr. Hamza also discussed about opportunity in crisis. And of course, I think his intervention about moving towards cleaner forms of fuels is well taken, and I'm glad that he mentioned it. One of the opportunities in crisis which we are indicating towards, and we hope that economic ministries and institutions of economic policy management will heed to this, is that now is the time to integrate those databases, something which we had been calling for so long. The fact that you don't have integration between FBR and Commerce Ministry, between FBR and Finance Ministry, the fact that databases of tax departments, 13 tax departments across the country are not linked, makes policy decision making all the more difficult. Now, one example of this is that Federal announced its own package, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa announced its own package, Punjab and Sindh went ahead as well. Now, a cursory analysis will reveal that all four packages have clear overlaps. So the fact that our finance departments are not talking to each other, not due to a recent mistake, but because there never was a system, because systems and data were never integrated. This is surely going to compromise not only the efficiency of public spending, but the value for money concept, the basic essence of value for money as well. And I'm sure that when donors start supporting Pakistan in the crisis and post-crisis phase, they would like to see some sort of surety in this direction. Now, one of my questions to Dr. Hamza, where he can help us, is that in order to avoid these overlaps, what should have been the role of Monetary and Fiscal Policy Coordination Board? Should a meeting of NEC should a meeting would have been called? Are we too late, or was there a case for calling in NEC much earlier? And why isn't an appetite for opening up the consultative process? Thank you.
Thank you, Waqar. Sajid, should I respond quickly, or
Yeah, please,
okay?
please. You should, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Waqar. Very comprehensive, very interesting observations. Few actually are pretty interesting. Again, I'll be very brief here. On the rule-based fiscal versus some discretionary opportunity given to the government, let me say it very little more bluntly, deliberately. To have rule-based or discretionary-based, you need to have fiscal policy in the first place. In Pakistan, it's mostly fiscal account management. There's a very fundamental difference. And it becomes very pronounced in these times of crisis, when you figure out we don't have flexibility or instruments to rely on to quickly adjust or respond to the changing needs. So that element is very, very weak. Once you look at the budget, you can literally set aside 80–90% of these spendings from day one. You cannot touch them, they're gone. You don't have room actually to do anything. Same on the revenue side as well, very little room. My point is a little more general. Flexibility in the budget positions. So in that context, I'll tend to agree. Some sort of appetite has to be increased for fiscal policy, in rule-based fiscal policy. In that context, I think, and touching upon your last comment, interprovincial coordination, for instance, or coordination between different ministries within the federal government, for instance, if needed, I don't think so. We have very effective mechanisms or committees. At least when I was part of that, it was primarily driven by the finance ministry and nothing. Planning Commission was totally clueless in most cases. They were not utilized effectively. That is a very good point that you're putting forward, and I think you should definitely push for that. A very structured, in a way, a secretariat, so to speak, of a nature that supports fiscal decisions of the country by bringing in elements of the provinces, by bringing in elements from different ministries and so on and so forth. It has to be there. It's not there. It's very informal, and then these kind of crisis situation doesn't help us. On the second point of greater participatory democracy, there are many modalities for that. I'm not in favor of central bank, for instance, consulting businesses and other parties before announcing their decisions. That does not mean they are not being participatory. The institution exists essentially for that purpose, to deliver on the mandate. What central bank should be doing is much more transparent, much more clear in their communication, and held accountable if things are not happening the way the government is wanting. But to consult a vast majority of population or private sector or businesses and others, I don't think so. That's a job of central bank, and they should not do that. On a regular basis, of course, there should be forums and platforms, maybe formal or informal, where this kind of dialogue should take place, yes. But before policy decisions, no. We have a monetary policy committee for that. So appoint competent people for that. And if they don't deliver, fire them. That's a mechanism I prefer, especially when it comes to central banking. Fiscal, I already agree partly with the rule-based approach, but trying to have an interprovincial, interfederal government kind of setup, maybe a sort of a secretariat would be a very good idea. Your point is very strong on the integrated databases. That's what I was essentially saying. You need to know in real time which provinces is doing what and why. So that's a great mechanism. The last observation, one more on the IMF RFI. There was a voice was not very clear. So I didn't really get what we were saying. Government is approaching IMF, so I think the IMF will be very receptive this time around in terms of lowering the targets or thinking a little bit out of the box. I hope so. Government should definitely push for that. Your last point, direct question, how to avoid overlap and should a emergency meeting of Monetary and Fiscal Coordination Board? Yes. Now that's an existing mechanism meant for regular consultations, and an urgent meeting of that should have been called. Absolutely. Like the urgent meeting of MPC was called to take a decision in a week's time. Similarly, MPF, Monetary Fiscal Coordination Board, should have been convened a very urgent meeting and fed their advice to National Economic Council. Again, an urgent meeting should have been called for sure. The problem with Monetary and Fiscal Policy Coordination Board, you know as well as I do, is again, it's been a hostage of the fiscal division primarily. They've not been very diligent, let's say, even in normal times to hold regular meetings, let alone get inputs or prepare formal background material. So again, yes, let's use this as an opportunity to push forward for this long overdue reform, and at least use the existing institutions and mechanisms and platforms that exist much more effectively, much more diligently and carefully. That only adds to the transparency and accountability part. That to me is the pillar of greater participatory democracy, not consulting private sector or businesses every single time government has to take a decision. Government is there to take decisions. And yes, they should consult, and they do. Well, people voted for the government and they're there. So they have participated. But there are other mechanisms, other forums that should be there. Decision making should be done much more cleanly through very formal, clearly defined platforms like Monetary and Fiscal Coordination Board, for instance, NEC, and so on and so forth. I pause here again. I'm sure there are more questions out there. But Waqar, very good points. Few of them are really brilliant. Push for them.
Thank you, Hamza. So let me now bring, I know you have another meeting at 2 p.m. your time and 12
We
p.m.
have
our
20
time.
minutes, don't worry. It's okay.
So let me bring more questions from the audience that we have here. So please unmute your mic if you have any question, and just give your name and question, please.
This is Imran Khalid. Hamza, for being a part of this discussion. So a quick question. We're talking about security. We've been talking about security mostly in terms of what's happening across the borders. Is it time to now take that forward and start talking about human security and what it really means for us? There have been theoretical discussions around that concept, but is it time for us to really start thinking about human security, where we take into account the issues pertaining to health, issues pertaining to the environment, issues pertaining to social security, and put them front and center rather than thinking about some of these other issues that we've been doing? And then if we start to do that, then things will hopefully fall into place. That's my take on it. How do you see this situation? Thank you.
I couldn't agree more with you, Imran. Absolutely spot on. This is the most opportunity time. This is literally an unprecedented shock, global. So you cannot get a better opportunity if you really want to put this forward. If I understand you correctly, you're basically saying, let's genuinely make a tangible change in our investments in our people. This is, again, I'm reiterating my own message in our report. Tangible meaning whatever you're spending on your health system and social protection measures, make sure they are doubled, quadrupled in a very clearly defined timeline.
Thank you. Any more questions, please, from the audience that we have around?
Hi, this is Aisha Kasrani from STPI. My question is sort of related to what Dr. Imran said about a change in global economic model from this more contemporary capitalist society to something that people around the world are talking about now. For example, the donut economics model, bringing more social justice and environmental sustainability and growth. Do you think there will be a change in overall global model based on the impacts right now? Because I think we'd be in a better position if we do get back on the growth trajectory, we'd be in a better position to meet some international agreements, such as the climate agreement and other SDGs. So do you will be a change from the Western world, from the capitalist society to a more socially just society?
So thanks, Aisha, for this very timely question. Very interesting question. My short answer is yes. That's the trend we are seeing, and that's where the global conversation is already going, and not just the conversation. Steps are actually being implemented globally. That's one reason, by the way, I joined UN, because I was driven as a professional to work on these lines. So if you look at our last year's publication, Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific 2019, published in April 2019, we call the upshot of that was investment in people is another one, taking care of the environment and respecting planetary boundaries is the one. So that's the agenda. UN system as a whole, myself included here in my team, are pushing very aggressively. Things are changing and have changed quite a bit, although a bit slow compared to what I would like them to change. But yes, that's the direction, and I'm all for it. And this is the way it should be. This crisis, at the beginning of my talk, I said the report that we discuss is part one. Part two is going to be engaging with the countries and other UN entities in the system. And part three is exactly what you are saying. So we are already talking about next year, what do we want the governments to commit? So we're trying to go after resolutions so they commit actually that they will have tangible improvements in XYZ areas, which are beyond pure economic considerations, which are beyond pure economic recovery. The example I was sharing, investments in health and social protection, for instance, or what are you doing regarding dealing with the climate emergency? The next issue of Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific, which will be published, I think, next week, by the way, is actually going after the very same conversation. This time we're going deeper into the climate emergency of what needs to be done and why and how the existing economic / development paradigm needs to be revisited and must be changed. So all for it. Thanks, Ajit.
Thank you, Hamza. Do we have more questions from the audience there? We will take 2-3 questions altogether, and then Hamza, you can reply in one go to all the questions.
Sure, no problem.
Before we bring, so please, any questions?
May I ask one question?
Yeah, Dr. Fatemi, you can please.
Yes, my name is Fatima. Thank you very much for your interesting input and interesting questions. Well, I have a background of social science, so I listen with that ear. So two last answers that you gave about the change in global economy, I want to make it more specify about power in the world, because some people think that the world after coronavirus situation will be, that the United States will not be anymore the superpower and China is coming to replace. Well, I have my own political reasons that to not accept it that much, but maybe you could give us, in adding to your last two answers, something more specific about reasoning it economically, whether you think that this will happen.
Thank you, Dr. Fatemi. 2 more questions, please, from the audience, if
okay.
they have. Okay, I think no questions are coming. So let me add from my side a couple of questions. So that you can club all together.
Sure, Sajid.
And I've been discussing with you already as well that this the COVID is bringing a big structural change. Even once it is over, it will leave the mark there on the policy making and the policy design and implementation. To me, I have been discussing with Dr. Solari as well. It has challenged the two separations actually. The one is the separation between macroeconomic policy and the social policy. It may not be go the way it have been going previously. The second separation that it has challenged is the fiscal and monetary policy, the standard separation of the objective of the fiscal and monetary policy. Just clubbing these together, what I have been discussing, how do you see the social content in macro policy, rather than a standard classical separation that monetary policy meets its objective, it creates sort of the social burdens, inequality, poverty, and something, and then social policy comes in terms of safety nets and the social protection to bridge that. So how do you see the chances of the social content within macro policy? And in this regard, I have two questions that you can touch upon. Number one, what would it take, particularly with reference to Pakistan, to bring the social content in macro policy? Be it fiscal policy, be it monetary policy. I mean, if you see the recent examples in Pakistan, we were celebrating that we are growing on the revenues, or we are growing on the non-tax revenues and the tax revenues. But where was this coming from? And that is actually the outcome of the separation between the macro and social policy. So what will it take to bring the social content in macro policy? You may touch upon economic governance model or the institutional arrangements. So that's my question number one. My question number two is, how do you read Pakistan's monetary policy, particularly, post global financial crisis? The standard separation has already been weakened. I mean, fiscal stability, financial stability has been weighing in the policy objectives of monetary policy, but it has not been so in Pakistan. Particularly, if you see recently, the conduct and design of monetary policy was creating sort of fiscal imbalances, and it has been pushing, taking much of the financial resources or the tax resources as a debt servicing, because of a very high, exceptionally high interest rates, which seems more to be focused on attracting the foreign capital flows. Uh, to me, it was the rupee who was the driving the seat. So how you see what changes will be required? Thank you. Apologies for a very longer
Oh,
question,
thanks, Ajay.
but this is a benefit of
This
being
is
a moderator.
Thanks for very extensive questions, very interesting ones. Requires a long conversation, but let me try and respond. The first question from, I think, Dr. Fatima, if I get it correctly, on the overall power dynamics and how that fit into the conversation we're having on trying to push the agenda towards social and environment considerations. Let me give you a very specific example of what has happened. You remember the Paris Agreement on environment and climate change, US pulled out. And initially, a lot of governments thought that it may not go through now because US being the big country and so on and so forth, what's going to happen? But you'll be very surprised, and if you already don't know, the rest of the world minus US decided to go ahead without them to the extent possible, because climate don't see boundaries. They will lead the global cooperation. But in the end, minus one country, which is very specific to current political situation in the US, by the way, they are going ahead with pushing forward for the environment agenda. So this is a very specific example that power dynamics have already changed, and the climate emergency of realities are now sinking in, that the model, the development approach has to change again. So the typical unipolar power-oriented world coming from the one superpower dictating rest of things is changing. It's going to take time. It's not going to go happen very quickly, but it's certainly changing. China is making it easier, you can say that, but China has its own challenges and problems and so on and so forth. But the change is definitely visible. In the language of Francis Fukuyama, which who declared in 1989 end of history, it is not the end. The conversation between capitalism, liberal democracy, socialism, government versus private sector, it is still very much alive. Now actually becoming all the more important when we bring in social and environment considerations. On Sajid's questions, if I get it correctly, bringing in social consideration in macro policy. Let me try and give a little bit of a research-oriented and academic response first, and then try and give you a policy angle on that. See, in virtually entire macro as a subject, the ultimate objective, or what goes in the utility function, essentially is material well-being, consumption or output. That is where all your policy trade-offs emerge, or your policy consideration emerge. That is the ultimate metric to judge success or failure of any policy, monetary, fiscal, social, whatever. That is why in practice, what it does is you end up giving priority to GDP maximization, material maximization, and so on and so forth. Once you achieve that, then you pay attention as an afterthought to pay attention to inequalities, and health systems and social protection and all that. It is emanating from that mindset that has been there for good 60, 70 years in the academic discourse, influencing policy making across the globe. That has to be revisited, must be revisited, is being revisited. We are seeing very practical questions on those lines. Let me share two examples for you, Sadiq. One is this, you must have heard by now, it's been a few years. What is the role of central banks in mitigating climate change, for instance, right? So in a typical macro world, that's a question nobody will ask 2 years earlier. It's a recognition that the objective of public policy, like monetary policy, essentially must go beyond just material well-being. And if it can play a role in issues like climate, well, it must. That's one example. The second example, which is not happened yet, but it's happening very fast. You might have heard of the Inequality Lab of Lucas Chancel and Timothy Piketty in Paris. They are now working on merging household income distribution data with national income accounts. What it does is, it's simply just like you have a GDP number and it's break up into consumption and investment and growth and whatnot and agriculture production. You'll have information alongside the overall well-being on the distribution of that change in income or national income. And that will actually then drive policy. So just like you look at the GDP, the ultimate yardstick of whichever policy is working or not working, you by definition will end up, policymakers, paying attention to distribution issues and inequalities, or more generally, the social considerations. So that's the kind of examples, both on academic and what is already happening in policy circles and research angles. Coming to a little bit more on the Pakistan side, on the last question I think you asked on the Pakistan monetary policy, there are a lot of interesting and good things. Developing country central banks, including Pakistan, have been doing far better than advanced countries. It's just that developing countries don't get the voice for that. The quantitative easing became extremely popular, but all developing countries have been doing it for decades. So for us, it was nothing new. We had this instrument depth in our countries. We were misusing it, that's a different conversation. However, the instruments were definitely there and were being used and so on and so forth. So, and then number two, a lot of developing country central banks have, one way or the other, a little bit of a development mandate, for instance. Central banks still have these targets given to credit to agriculture or SME because they want to promote that segment of society. It's always there in many developing countries, which is not directly related to monetary or financial stability per se. But central banks as public institutions have been performing, are performing, and probably should perform in a clear manner these kind of functions, as long as they don't compromise the overall mandates. By overall mandate means ensuring the purchasing power of your currency in a nutshell. Higher interest rates and capital outflows and that conversation, that to me is a financial literacy issue. This is, maybe I'm mistaken. In my experience, far too many people, and forget about people, far too many economists. I'm talking about those who are teaching monetary policy in several Pakistani universities, several researchers. I don't think so. They still understand relationship between interest rate and exchange rate on a daily basis. A vast majority still thinks of interest rate going up means capital outflow, means exchange rate depreciation, because that's what they are taught in the macro textbooks. A practical central banking doesn't function that way. They are daily rupee interbank markets and they are daily FX interbank markets. What happens there and how, unfortunately, is not available in many textbooks. It can be inferred from central bank communication and so on and so forth, but it has to be there. So these considerations are there. Fiscal policy impact of monetary policy, high interest rate impacting fiscal positions. Another long standing conversation has been there on that. That is why the Monetary and Fiscal Coordination Board exists. That is why they share prior information, and they do, by the way. I'm not sure recently they're doing that or not, but typically they do. What it means is, in very simple words, fiscal authority shares their plans, monetary authority shares their plans, and so on and so forth. By plans, I mean, again, let's try to be very simple. Fiscal authority will say, this is the X% going to be the budget and Y% of that will be financed in the banking system. According to that, central bank can say, okay, for this I need this much liquidity and credit creation, and for that my interest rate has to be around this number to deliver the inflation target. That conversation happens. What in practice happens is the way fiscal input is prepared, one, and pretty much every single instance that is deviated, and deviated by such a big margin that the entire exercise becomes meaningless. That brings me back to the observation made by Waqar. I think he was spot on. Some sort of appetite for fiscal rules has to be there. Some sort of capacity in the government to develop fiscal policy, not just manage the accounts, has to be there by coordinating with provinces, by effectively coordinating with central banks, by effectively coordinating with those areas and ministry which are delivering social protection and health systems and so on and so forth. After getting their input, then it will be much better position. A 3 to 5 year medium-term fiscal framework, which probably exists on paper, but it's not accountable. Nobody asked the government, oh, by the way, you missed it last time. That is the way to go about it. I think mechanisms are there, institutions are there, they just need to be strengthened. And let me conclude on Waqar's observation. By strengthening these processes and these platforms and these coordination mechanisms, we will strengthen the participatory democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hamza. Before we close, let me ask Dr. Waqar Saab if he has any comments, quick comments or feedback, and then I'll bring Dr. Suleri to close the program. Waqar Saab, do you have any feedback?
Thank you very much, Dr. Sajid and Dr. Hamza. I think very insightful views from all the participants as well. And I think Dr. Hamza has rightly given us some homework to move forward. And I think there is, as I also said in my remarks, there is a strong case for pushing for the existing forums to work as per their mandate. And perhaps colleagues at STPI can now brainstorm in the light of Dr. Hamza's advice that how to make monetary and fiscal policy board more responsive, at least to current times, and maybe to also sort of push for an early NEC meeting. Let's not wait for the forthcoming budget to come. Emergency times, of course, call for much extraordinary measures. So we can, of course, collectively brainstorm how to go about this advice from Dr. Hamza.
Thank you, Dr. Waqar. Let me now invite Dr. Suleri to final comments and the close.
Yeah, a profound gratitude, Hamza, for sparing time out and interacting with us, educating us. And of course, we at STPI are available to take this message forward in Pakistan, and we will be more than happy to support UNSCAP in any kind of policy research that you would like to do. If you require any case studies from Pakistan to take this work further, it's an excellent report. I'll request Sajid to circulate it to among our researchers so that they can go through it and they can write their own op-eds and own policy papers based on this report. If you can share with us the specific data for South Asia, because in that report there's certain data which is South and West Asia, which of course is UNSCAP's own classification. But if you can share any data for the 8 South Asian countries, that would help a lot for us in our own analysis, some of the work that we are doing with our South Asian counterparts. And we look forward to engaging with you in over next few days again, whenever you have time. So while we are working at home, we are trying to have this sort of consultation with experts on a daily basis. So whenever you have time, even on weekend, we'll be more than happy to again grab an hour from your busy schedule and listen to you. Thank you.
Dr. Hamza, thank you so much. Any final remarks, if you have any?
Just wanted to thank Waqar and Abid for the opportunity for engaging. I normally are reluctant to engage with Pakistan because I don't look at the data on daily basis. So as I said, my valuation would be a bit minimal. This one was based on the report that we have produced, so I thought a little bit comfortable. And number two, I basically regard Sajid a lot. He's probably one of the most prominent macroeconomists we have out there. So I look at his comments and observations. I hear his insights very, very carefully. So it was a great opportunity to engage with Sajid and many, many other colleagues here. Thank you very much for all your time. Given that we are living this work from home modality, I think we should be able to do it relatively easy again. But Abid, not on the weekends, please. Let's try and find some time in the weekday. We will be happy to do that. On the data, they were preliminary estimates of forecasts, you can say, but the full data will be published with the survey coming out on 8th April. But if you want something specific after you get the report, let me know, and I can see if we can share that also. So thanks a lot. I'm getting messages on the email that they are ready for me in the next one. So thank you very much all, and like we say, until next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Hamza. Bye-bye.